Well, here we are, Rawcast listeners, after an unannounced hiatus going back probably 6 weeks, would be my guess. I didn't actually pay attention to how long it's been since I last sat in front of a microphone by my lonesome. And I apologize for anybody that regularly listens to Rawcast AD. This was not my intention to go weeks and weeks without providing episodes. But I know that it's not exactly a hit podcast. I'm humble enough to know where my stats lie or lay, because it's an inanimate kind of thing, rather intangible. It's not a human itself, rather just a recording of me talking stupidly into a microphone. But where the fuck have I been? If you have followed along through the journey, you know that we're still putting out episodes of My Three Bitches. And I guess that's where the trouble started on my end was My 3B allows me to exaggerate my personality. I very much have fun exaggerating my personality, amplifying like the faults, almost making fun of my own shortcomings, so to speak. And really looked forward to pushing my 3B to have it grow an audience. And I let it consume me to a certain degree. I was just pushing it as much as I could. That became my sole focus. But as I got more into the post-production side of my 3B, that took up a lot more time. And so eventually Rawcast kind of fell by the wayside. But then, of course, I was loving making episodes of My 3B, but with the schedule that my wife and I are on, it seemed like a weekly podcast was actually being recorded maybe 2 days a month. And when that is the bottom line joy in your life, I accept things as they are. I raise my kids. I deliver mail. I read when I can. And so the most exciting thing that happens outside of being a parent or being a mail carrier is being able to actually let myself off the leash and really have a fucking blast with my wife making episodes of My 3B. But because recording episodes were so few and far between, it naturally depression started to sit in, because it was so many days would go by, or my wife would get stuck having to work extra hours on top of the shifts she was already assigned, so that when the day came to record, she was so sleep deprived she was in no condition to actually sit down and record with me. And that's no fault of her own. I understood it, but at the same time, even though nobody is necessarily to blame, like you can't just point a finger and say, well, this is why, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that her boss scheduled her for 4 additional hours every fucking day, 6 or 7 days in a row. That is what happened. And so I was left to my own devices to manage or work through my own feelings of disappointment, my own emotions, knowing that the job that I have leaves me feeling like it's not worthwhile. Sure, it pays the bills, but there's no sense of accomplishment, no joy. There's nothing great about it in any sense of the word other than paying the bills. So the fact that it just serves a purpose of me selling my time in order to keep a roof over my head and of course my family. Like just because you're doing the right thing for your family doesn't necessarily mean you're going to enjoy it. And so, in sort of a last ditch effort, after having worked so many jobs over the years, I felt like my 3B was a unique enough concept that I could push that and possibly turn it into a revenue source. So that in some sort of way I would realize my own freedom in this life. And one thing I've really realized with that, my conclusion there is, and unfortunately, this is going to be coming out before, I believe, episode 14 of My 3B due to our recording schedule. I hope you guys look forward to that. I very much enjoy making those episodes and putting them up on YouTube, whereas I also very much enjoy keeping Rawcast in audio-only format. If I did have this on video, what you would essentially see is me just looking at different areas of the room or staring at the computer screen, ensuring that the program is functioning properly. And in episode 14 of My 3B, which I believe we named Pressures of the Midnight Mind, Jess brings up the topic of basically like the complexities of the mind. And she goes on to, kind of talk about a different vein of thought than I thought she was going to go with. So if you want to know where she's going with it, you can look at episode 14. But for me, I thought she was inspired to discuss this due to a conversation that we have had. Through Dr. Jordan Dennison, I was set on a path of basically audiobooks so far, reading up on the works of clinical psychologists, and it allowed me to get a better grasp or understanding of who I am or the functions of my own mind. But even though you can have the understanding of some of those topics within your own mind, doesn't make the work of dealing with those issues any easier. Nothing is ever easy. But I fell back into drinking on the regular again. And I realize now that I'm coming to you again from a place of like, do I have a beer in front of me right now? Yes. When we recorded those 2 episodes that haven't even come out yet of My 3B, was I having beers? Yes. But I went 5 days without any alcohol. And sitting in front of me are the last 2 beers I have in the fridge, and I currently have no plans of going to buy more. The drinking, it seems, was a way for me to, the classical approach to it, basically numbing the pain, but really it was distracting myself from dealing with almost the mundane, having to jump through all the hoops. This is real life, folks. So jumping through all the hoops, and once you get through the final hoop, there's no audience there cheering you on. There's no gold medal for you. I don't really care to have a participation trophy either. But once you jump through that final hoop, it's just nothing. You're left with yourself. And so instead of embracing the suck and working through these emotions I was feeling, as is possible with a depressive episode is the slow downward spiral into despair. And I mean, there was no direct cause of this necessarily, other than, as I've described before, I'm sure, on episodes of Rawcast. I mean, imagine trying to start your car when the battery's dead. You know, like, you have the good intentions, like you want to run to the store and get the groceries, but the vehicle just won't start. You can't get the vehicle to turn over so you can put it in gear. And so, I mean, that's where I've been stuck for the past few weeks. You know, I get amped up for episodes of My 3B, but other than that, there's very little enthusiasm in my life. And this is of my own doing, because early on, after, discovering that I was dealing with anxiety and depression, I was able to control or put a lid on the more positive emotions. And much more difficult to deal with were the negative emotions, the anger, the fear. And so I've done a much better job on that, allowing me to more or less coast through life in the neutral position. And so I just, on a whim, happened to pull up an episode of The Midnight Gospel. And, we're not talking about the wonderful, kooky, psychedelic, crazy animations. If you've watched Adventure Time, you're aware of Pendleton Ward's work. This is focusing more on Duncan Trussell and his podcast, The Duncan Trussell Family Hour. But more specifically, and I bring this up in My Three Bitches episode 14, so I want to apologize if some of this seems repetitious, but at the same time, in My Three Bitches, due to the amplified or exaggerated nature of my personality, there's a bit of a shock value, whereas here you're getting the more pensive approach. You're getting you're getting a glimpse inside my mind, so to speak, the real deal. It is Rawcast after all, so you are getting to hear me talk about the more raw emotions or the raw thoughts. But obviously, the thoughts aren't necessarily as raw because you're not hearing about them occur in real time so much as you're hearing about them after I've had some time to mull them over. I hope you still love me. But, no, in this particular episode of Midnight Gospel, they kind of bring up the concept of reincarnation, where there's a prison planet where these simulations are doomed to die over and over and over. And for the most part, these are violent simulations. And so they're committing sins. They're doing the wrong thing, and then they die. They're then judged and brought back to life. And so in the show, the main character, Clancy, asks how long this is going to go on. And another character, voiced by Jason Louv, who this is on an episode of the Duncan Trussell Family Hour, where they kind of talk about Buddhism, enlightenment, and they touch on death. But Jason said it's going to go on as long as it takes for him to figure it out. And so later on in the episode, yes, this particular prisoner that the main character is entangled with finally does get it figured out. But in that episode, they discuss how, in a way, our own reality is perceived reality. And in a way, they're looking at it, they use an example of, say you're playing a video game, but it's like you're sitting there playing the video game long enough that you forget that it's actually a video game. So we do need to take the time to, get back away from the screen and remember that it is a video game. And just that simple thought of taking that step back, because the inherent suffering that goes along with life is in forgetting that it is kind of like a video game. So the more I spun the gears in my head, how I can't think of anything profound to say in regards to basically I didn't get caught up in my head, but I was always allowing a space in the back of my mind for a better way to market or advertise my 3B, because I did very much, I almost desperately wanted the My Three Bitches podcast to grow. Unfortunately, what we saw was it started off with relatively favorable numbers for a, new to video podcast on YouTube, and the numbers actually slowly went down. Now, this is something that I expected, but given what we've seen this year in 2020, the death of 3 of my family members, the COVID-19, this really fucking god-awful election cycle. Like, there's you can't turn on a screen without somebody trying to sell you fear and anxiety and worry. And we're not talking about existential dread here. Not quite. We almost blow a kiss to existential dread. But what I was doing was I was taking something that truly brought me joy. Can you buy joy? You can buy an almond joy. Not sure about joy itself, though there have been studies that show that money technically can buy happiness up until a certain amount of income. I want to say it's in the neighborhood of $120,000, but don't quote me. Just Google that shit and then let me know if I was right. I got too much on my plate to Google frivolous thoughts. No, I'm just kidding. I totally allow myself time to Google frivolous ideas. But let's get back to where we were going with it. My apologies once more, folks. But so, by almost desperately racking my brain to come up with marketing ideas or advertising strategies to try to put my 3B on a slightly less than organic growth scale, I was introducing negative feelings to an otherwise joyful experience in my life. And so I did have to come to a point recently where I pushed back away from the computer and remembered that I was just playing a video game. Because the more you tense up with the perceived reality, the more suffering you're inviting into your own life. Now, to some, life itself is suffering, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. If you're being present, you can let go of the suffering. We're talking mindfully and spiritually, not necessarily physically and emotionally. I mean, there are still things that you must deal with in life, both physically and emotionally, that are going to cause a degree of suffering. Love itself, in relation to loss, can cause real physical pain. But when you yourself are tensing up in order to push for something that needs to more or less be allowed to flow, like the river. Pick a river, any river, your favorite stream, your babbling brook, your crick, fishing for some crawdads. I allowed myself to create too much tension and attach that to arguably the most joyful activity I have outside of being a dad. And so I introduced suffering to that joyful experience of My Three Bitches. As much as I would love My Three Bitches to grow and become a staple to podcast fans, that's not yet a reality in itself. For now, it's a joyful hobby. And I accept that fact. It's just I tried to run away from my current problems. The fact that I am performing what feels like the last job I will have and not enjoying it. Sorry, I was trying to hold back a burp. But no, do I love working for the post office? Do I take pride in working for the post office? Yeah, admittedly, there was a time when I took great pride in working for the post office, but not anymore. 2020 put the kibosh on that shit. Now when it comes to work, and to me, defining work is not necessarily punching in and selling or trading your time for some greenbacks, Work is whatever you perceive that work to be. If making cutting boards in your garage on weekends is a hobby of yours, that still takes work. But if it's something that you can be passionate about, do you need to sign a multi-million-dollar deal with Pampered Chef to sell those cutting boards that you make in your garage? No. As long as the activity, that hobby, the time you put into it, the effort you put into that work brings you enough joy, then it's definitely worth it. Like I said, you don't have to cut a contract to sell them to a retailer. Even if you spend all year making those and giving them out as gifts around Christmas, that's far more meaningful than hit one-click buy on Amazon. And so I'm not out of the woods yet, folks. But I'm remembering to see the forest for the trees. And I'm not pushing so damn hard. I've gotten away from listening to motivational speakers because just because you want something bad enough doesn't mean that you have to force yourself through unnecessary resistance, creating unnecessary tension for yourself. Yes, everybody would love for their dreams to come to fruition. But every story of an overnight success you hear about is usually just a really shitty headline. This overnight sensation. Well, that overnight sensation was actually somebody who spent the last 22 years perfecting that art. If I remember correctly, the rough estimate is every overnight success took the better part of a decade of time, effort, blood, sweat, and tears. So if that's the idea that you're going to spend 10 years pushing and pushing and pushing for your dream just to one day be considered an overnight success, I'm not interested in that hustle. I've talked before about how I had to get away from sales and network marketing because resistance can be fine. Network marketers and motivational speakers love to tell you that it takes a great deal of pressure to make a diamond. But at the end of the day, a diamond only has perceived value. A diamond itself has no intrinsic value. Or monetarily speaking, should I say. And so just because I want my 3B to become, a podcast that has a sizable enough following that the equipment or the costs associated with doing a podcast on that level don't have to come out of my own pocket when I'm already, considered working poor. And so I apologize for the long delay in getting a new Rawcast episode out there. But that's where I was. Not necessarily stuck in my own head, but life had me on the ropes, and I just wasn't forcing myself to recenter my mind and get back up. You're going to win some, you're going to lose some. And unfortunately, when you're dealing with issues like anxiety and depression, you got to take one day at a time. But my final thought is that perception is key. When we're living our own realities, perception is everything. Because though there are a great deal of things in this world, I don't necessarily believe that anything has an inherent good or bad, but rather our own perception identifies and tags any given topic with good or bad. And I'm not saying like if there's a natural disaster and a bunch of people die, it's like, well, it's not inherently bad. Well, that's a muddy subject. Like, do we technically have a deal with overpopulation? Some would argue yes. So a few less lives on this planet, is it better off for the population control situation? Maybe. But realistically, I'm somebody who would assign a tag of bad to a natural disaster in which there's a loss of life. Because did those people necessarily deserve to die? No. So that was a bad example. I set up a bad example. Like, come with me down the wrong road. We're supposed to be one block over, but let's walk down this road just because. But I mean, realistically, like with my job, it's my own built up frustrations with it. The way I see it is it's like you just freshly washed your car by hand, and now you're driving down the road, and with every bug or leaf that lands on your car, it's going to get dirty. And if you don't remember to take the time to clean it, eventually you're not going to be able to see through that windshield clearly because there's going to be bug guts all the fuck over that thing. And so I find myself, at least in regards to the job, that my windshield's about half dirty, and I'm tired of working on vehicles, so do I necessarily want to clean that windshield? No. But for the sake of my family, it's the necessary direction. It's the necessary activity, the action that I need to take of cleaning that windshield. But remembering that the mundane maintenance still needs to be done, whether it brings you joy or not, because they are necessary for your own current reality. And so I think that I'm going to do my best to continue making episodes of Rawcast and try to stick to that weekly basis, like I've got my 3B on, because this is where I'm allowing myself to slow everything down, be present with myself. You can fill your day with activities to run from the feeling all you want, but as soon as you get a moment to yourself, that feeling returns. And as soon as you get that feeling and you can let go of the tension because of the pressures you put on yourself, you can learn to love the feeling of getting in touch with yourself. And so Anybody that listens to this, that has listened to prior episodes, thanks for sticking with me on this. And I look forward to filling your ear holes later with subsequent episodes. It should be good, folks. Thanks for tuning in for another episode of Rawcast. Much love.